Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the joint work session with the Planning Commission and design review of Friday, March 21st. Call the meeting to order and ask for approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Favor?
Yes.
Okay. So today we have a presentation by Marcy, you going to start us off? Introduce us or Lisa? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there?
Alyssa's gonna start you off, but hello.
Okay. Hi, first we need to do public comment. Is there anyone in the audience or on Zoom that would like to make public comment? If you'd raise your hand on Zoom. Okay, so we're ready for the presentation.
Okay, I will make this quick. Hello, councilors and commissioners. I'm Alyssa Gertler, the Clatsop County Housing Manager. We are continuing a conversation that we've had over several previous meetings about the concept of a lease to locals program, which is a program that is being used in other vacation communities around the country. The conversation emerged out of an earlier conversation we had about looking at taxing vacant homes in some way in Cannon Beach. You may remember from the presentation we just had from 3J that Cannon Beach has a vacant home rate of 69%, which is higher than anyone in the county. Gerhardt is next at 46%. And so really starting to think about how you might address some of the affordable housing issues through this tool. We have Kai Froelich from Placemate, who is behind the technology platform that supports most of the lease to local programs across the United States. She'll talk about the ones in California, the mountain towns, East Coast, and they have an interesting business model and an interesting sort of partnership model with local jurisdictions that seem like the next logical part of the conversation for us here in Cannon Beach in terms of how might this be implemented and what might be the questions and issues that you would want to raise before going further. So she seems to be the national expert on this topic, and I'm very happy to introduce her to make the presentation. So Kai, I will turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad that there has been some interest in this since it was briefly mentioned by Marcy and Alyssa at the meeting last week. So do I have sharing access?
Yes, you should be able to share your screen.
I think there it is. Okay. Can you all see there? I'm going to put this into slideshow mode.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
All right, let's see. For some reason it doesn't want to do slideshow. Oops. Okay, hold on. Sorry, everyone. There we go. All right, so as Alyssa said, my name is Kai Froelich, and I'm the co-founder and the chief impact officer of Placemate. We are the company that has created and founded this program called Lease to Locals, where we convert empty units and short-term rentals in vacation towns across the country. We convert them to homes specifically for employees of the local workforce in these towns and jurisdictions. Oops. So I'm just going to give a background on the company and on the program, and then do a market deep dive for Truckee, California, which was our first market for the Lease to Locals program and where the company was founded. So we have the most robust data on that market, and show you really what this looks like in real life. And then talk about what it's like to bring Lease to Locals to a new market and what that takes. So this is the Placemate vision and mission statement. We envision a world where communities thrive because local employees can find stable housing. So the vision is not specifically for Lease to Locals. We think that that is a really great program that we've developed and created and replicated across the country. It is not the only program. It is not the only program that also towns and counties and jurisdictions need. We say that like this is one rung in the housing ladder. And it really needs to exist alongside other programs and other long-term projects such as building, deed restrictions, that sort of thing. Our mission is to help local employees secure housing and tourism-based communities through innovative public and private partnerships across the country, which is why, and I'll go into this a little bit later, in bringing this to a new market, we always have to have a really good partner on the ground, and that is almost always a public partner. We have in one instance had a private partnership, and then it kind of morphed into a public partnership, and I can talk more about that later. But I think that the reason why these programs work so effectively across the country is because of the public-private partnership model. So here's just a bit about the evolution of our business. We launched the proof of concept in the spring 2019 before we had a lease to locals program. My co-founder, who is my husband, and I launched our marketplace we kind of dubbed it the Airbnb for locals housing, and we did that in Truckee, California. He and I had moved to the Lake Tahoe area in Truckee from San Francisco, thinking that nothing could be harder than finding housing in San Francisco. And of course, there are all of these second homes that just sit empty all the time. And of course, people are going to want to rent those out if they're otherwise sitting empty. And we realized that while there were a lot of second homeowners who were interested in renting those places out, they were often remote, did not really have great ties to the community anymore, had the house in the family for years, and they really needed someone to help them create a trusted relationship with someone who is going to be renting their home. And so we really launched the business as more of this platform that was kind of like Airbnb for long-term and seasonal rentals, specifically for people who worked locally. And then during COVID, we of course weren't sure exactly what was going to happen with our business or housing in the area or places like Tahoe and Truckee. And I'm sure that in the very beginning days in Cannon Beach, it felt the same of now everybody's sheltered in place and nobody's going to be able to come here, and we rely so much on tourism. And little did we know that the exact opposite would happen, and everyone would want to come to places like Cannon Beach and Truckee and Tahoe and Nantucket. And so the housing director at the time at the town of Truckee said, "We love what you guys are doing as a business, and you've already been helping so many people find housing. Why don't we put a little bit of money behind it and have a partnership with you guys, and we can kind of sweeten the deal and encourage more homeowners to rent out to locals." And so that's how the Lease to Locals pilot was launched in fall 2020. Then we rolled out the program nationally by launching in Breckenridge and Summit County the following year. Last spring rather, almost exactly a year ago, this April, we launched our 10th market in Woodstock, Vermont. Before that, we had launched a few other East Coast markets. And then last summer, we also launched a new program, our second program called the Rooted Renters Program, which is similar to a Lease to Locals program, although it provides incentives to homeowners who have already been renting locally or renting long-term to local employees. And that is to incentivize them to continue doing the right thing, so to speak. That was really in response to every time we had launched one of these programs, homeowners would call us and say, "This seems really unfair. Why are you incentivizing people who have been doing Airbnb, who have been leaving their second homes empty? We have been doing the right thing all along. We think that we should also get a piece of the pie." And so we really heard them and really wanted to respond to that. And so we launched this other program called Rooted Renters, and that is an incentive for, unlike Lease to Locals, which is for a 1-year incentive to really change behavior. The Rooted Renters program is an incentive to continue renting for at least another 3 years. So that is really to kind of lock in more medium term solutions, as opposed to long-term solutions like building and deed restrictions. So this is kind of how the program works. So it's converting, as I said, existing housing stock to new longer term rentals for local workforce. What is deemed local is really up to the jurisdiction. When we go to create the program guidelines, they can decide, does that mean anywhere in this town? Does that mean anywhere in the unified school district? Does that mean anywhere within kind of a regional housing district that they've already created for a housing element? That's really up to them. But then the program provides property owners with cash incentives to convert properties into seasonal and long-term rentals. In a lot of places, the seasonal option does not make sense. We've found that now that we work on the East Coast as well, seasonal options don't really work. It really works in places like the Mountain West, where there are two distinct seasons, both for property owners who have specific seasons that they want to be using their homes. So in the winter, some people want to only be using their houses to ski. They never go up there in the summer, but there are also seasonal employees who do come only for the summer months. And vice versa, that can happen. And so those seasonal options are really great on all of our East Coast markets, where it's really just a one season town for tourism. Really the long-term option, the 12-month option, it really makes the most sense. And I have a feeling that would be the same for Cannon Beach. And then this allows local governments to quickly and efficiently address critical missing middle housing needs. So we have never done one of these programs where the income cap has been capped at 80% AMI or below. It's always been higher. I think that the lowest we've ever done has been at 120% AMI. Some of the jurisdictions that we work with and their program guidelines, they say there's actually no income cap, because we know that so long as you're working locally, people at all income levels who work locally are still not really going to be able to access the buying market. And so they're really stuck in this rental market, and therefore we need to make this available to everyone who's renting and who is working locally. And then part of this also for the quick and efficient housing is that when we first started working on this business, we were working alongside the executive director at the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation. And she had always said to us, we can't build our way out of this problem. Like, there's absolutely no way that only building is going to be what we need. We have really short build seasons. It's really expensive. This was even before COVID, when there were all of the bottlenecks in labor and materials. The part of the reason why these places are so popular for tourism and so popular for people to be buying second homes is because of their natural beauty. And what comes with the natural beauty is that there are very clear delineations of places where you can no longer grow out. So you can no longer build outwards. You can no longer build upwards, because these are not cities. And so therefore we need to be able to figure out how to either do infill, or we have to create more multifamily housing, which, as we all know, can also be quite contentious in places like this. And then we also need to just figure out how to use the properties and the land that's available more efficiently. So these are all of our markets. We have launched 12 markets to date. Right near this other little marker in Colorado should also be Breckenridge and Summit County, where we launched in 2021. We no longer work there. We wound down the program at the end of 2024. We still love the partners that we worked with. They decided that after 3 years, having created over 100 units in the area, they had at the same time built enough units that they didn't need to be putting the same amount of money into this program. And so we are still in touch with them. We'll probably be working with them on more projects in the future. But that's why those two markets are no longer on this map. Everywhere else is where we are live. Our most recent launch was last month in Washoe, Tahoe, which is the Nevada side of North Lake Tahoe. And then our three East Coast markets are Vermont, Woodstock, Vermont, Provincetown on Cape Cod, and then Nantucket. And we'll be launching three more Cape Cod and the Islands markets this summer and fall. So this is going to be the market deep dive to see exactly how this program plays out. So this is going to be in Truckee, where we launched, as I said, in November 2020, deep in the COVID times. So just an overview of the program guidelines there. As I said, that the program guidelines can largely be determined by the jurisdiction. We always make the joke, like, this is not some startup like Uber where we toggle something on and we say, okay, great, now we're live in Austin. And if this works for that community, that's great. And if it doesn't work for that community, then we're going to be there anyway. We really want for this to work there. We want to have a partnership. It doesn't really work without that. And in order for this to work really effectively in a community, we need to be able to create nuances in the program guidelines that are specific to that place. So in Truckee, the property must be located within the town of Truckee. And Truckee is a complicated community in that it's in an incorporated town that sits within two different counties. We say that the property must not have had full-time tenants in the last 12 months. If they have, then that homeowner can likely participate in the Rooted Renters Preservation Program. The leases can be seasonal, and we deem seasonal as 5+ months, or long-term, which is 12+ months, and the rent cannot exceed $3,500 a month. We have done this in all different ways, and we've seen some of the partners want to do per unit rent caps, saying a 1-bedroom can't be more than $1,500, a 3-bedroom can't be more than $3,600. We generally have found that an overall rent cap of $3,500 works well in a place that has demographics similar to Truckee. And we found that I think per homeowner psychology, $3,500 or an overall rent cap is better for retention rates. So people tend to continue without an incentive if they get to choose their own rent from the beginning. The incentive amounts can vary based on the length of lease and the number of qualified tenants. And in Truckee, the incentive is up to $18,000. At least 50% of the household must be locally employed. And that in Truckee means within the Tahoe-Truckee Unified School District boundaries. And they must work locally at least 20 hours per week. Some of our markets say that they have to work at least 30 hours per week locally. And that an average adult gross income cannot exceed 150% AMI. The incentive amounts are here in this graph, so you can see at the top, these are the seasonal incentives per qualifying tenant. And at the bottom row is the long-term per qualifying tenant. So in order to really appeal to people doing a longer-term lease, we have it be more than double the seasonal lease. However, if someone goes into a 6-month lease, really likes their tenants, and their tenants say, actually, I've finished the ski season, I really want to stay here, and I found a great summer job, and the homeowner says, wonderful, we really like you, we've decided we're not going to use our house this summer, why don't you stay? They can get a second seasonal amount if they go to the full year. So these are the results, or these are the number of property owners who we've worked with there. We've talked to over 1,000 homeowners in Truckee. 759 of them were not qualified or not interested once we've had that initial phone call with them. Not qualified can often mean they already had long-term tenants, or they were not in the correct geographic boundary, or they had an ADU that was not compliant with the town. Generally, the town doesn't want to give funding for that. Out of 261 that were qualified and interested, we have now unlocked over 215 properties there. We do about, I would say, 45 properties a year in Truckee. So out of the 215 properties, 51 of those properties are currently in an active lease. 164 of them have graduated, meaning they've gone through the program already, whether they did a seasonal or a long-term lease. And 114 of those 215 have decided to continue to rent long-term, either to an existing to their existing tenant in the program or to a new local tenant group. So we do surveys at the end, and I'll go into this. Part of our service is that we do compliance throughout the year lease. And we do homeowner surveys and tenant surveys at the end of the lease. And we have found that even after the incentive is finished, the homeowners, 70% of them will continue to rent locally. So the results for the tenants is that we've housed over 500 people, which is something we're really proud of. We just hit that milestone the last month. The average rent per bedroom is just over $1,000, and the average rent per property is just under $2,500. We see that most of these programs will have an average of 2 bedrooms per property. Of course, the incentive can go up to $18,000 if someone is housing 4 qualified tenants. That is not always the case, whether that is because of the makeup of a household or because of the size of the property. But so the average incentive has been $7,500. To date, we've spent $26,000 in marketing, and this is now over 4.5 years. So we haven't spent any marketing money in Truckee, I don't think, in the last 3 years. It really was only for the first 1.5 years, and now it's just been word of mouth. Our administrative fee to us has been almost $350,000, and the grants committed have been just over $1.5 million. And again, that's in almost 5 years. So the reason why we break it out this way is just to show that we have an administrative fee as a percentage of the pie. It's quite small compared to the grants committed, and the marketing is even smaller than that. So this is just the feedback. I'll give you a second just to look over this. If you all can see it, some of the comments from property owners and tenants. So this is how we bring lease to locals to a new market. What needs to be in place to launch is that we need a really good partner on the ground. That needs to either be a public jurisdiction, which is what it's been 11 out of 12 times. We did launch originally on the island of Nantucket off the coast of Massachusetts with a nonprofit. They came to us and said, we're a newly formed nonprofit. We're a 501c4. And so we do a lot of advocacy around housing, and we really would love to get a program under our belt. We think that this is the right thing for our community. And we also think that because Nantucket is an island, a town, and a county, that it is going to take quite a while to bring this through all of the jurisdictional levels. And so we would really like to just partner with you to get this off the ground. And we have the philanthropic dollars to get that started. It was a really successful program. We do well over 30 properties per year there. We're in our 2nd year, and we now do about 40 to 50 properties a year. And what they did was they really helped us navigate the community and then helped us get it over to be in a partnership with the public jurisdiction. So it started out with the nonprofit partner, but then over the course of the year, it then moved over to the public side. And we're now partnered with Housing Nantucket, which is part of the Affordable Housing Trust, which is completely publicly funded. So the second thing that we need to have is the funds in place for the first year of the program, ideally for the first 2 years of the program, just so there's a little bit of longevity. We've never had a program that's only lasted for 1 or 2 years. The shortest program, the only program that's ended was after more than 3 years. And I think that is really the amount of time that is needed to see some real success in the program and to make a real dent with the housing market and getting tenants housed. And then there really needs to be some political will from the community and or elected officials. And we've had it go both ways where we've talked to potential new markets, and sometimes people will come to us who are just local concerned citizens and say, we really want for this program to happen. And then it turns out that politically there's not really enough will from the elected officials. And it's happened another way where local elected officials have come to us and said, we really want for this program to happen. But in order for that to happen, we need there to be a local option tax, and then that's not voted on by the constituents. So there generally needs to be some good political will among the community. And generally that just means that there needs to be some consensus built already that there is a housing problem, and that conversion and using existing housing stock is generally a good way to help tackle that problem. So then also with the program definition, meaning the program guidelines, just figuring out these are just some of the things that are that we go through with the program guidelines. What are the eligible units? Does that mean that there are existing short-term rentals? There are empty homes? Are rooms going to be allowed in the program? Oftentimes that is the case in a lot of our markets. Are there going to be secondary dwellings or ADUs? If that's a big part of the housing inventory. And then determining the incentive structure and length. So I talked about that a little bit before. Do seasonal leases make sense? Is year-round really the only option? Which is totally fine if it is. And then really defining the workforce. Where is local? Like, what does local mean for working locally? Is there going to be an income cap? Should there be a rent cap? Exactly what type of tenant are we trying to serve? And that really goes back to looking at a housing needs assessment, deciding what are the units that really need to be unlocked? What size? Or is it mostly families, single people, groups of roommates that need to be housed? Who are these people? Where are they working? How much money are they making? So this is just an example of like a target property owner. So a year-round resident with an accessory dwelling unit or a secondary dwelling, currently short-term renting. Then also maybe expanding that to a second homeowner with a secondary dwelling or an ADU that stays empty. And then third, empty rooms. We have allowed empty rooms in I think every program that we've launched. And I would say that overall in the last now almost 5 years, private rooms have been below 10% of the units that are unlocked in this program. This is the example incentive structure. So a target lease length of 12 months or greater, or a seasonal lease of 5 months or greater up to 12 months. And that would depend on how much incentive was getting paid. And then we really say that the incentive should be generous enough to bridge the gap between short-term and long-term. So if this program is really going after mostly short-term rentals instead of empty homes, then generally the incentive is going to be somewhat larger in order to be covering that delta between what a homeowner can make on the short-term rental market and what they can charge for a long-term rental. tenant profile example is that they are working full-time, 30 hours a week, working for a local employer or working for themselves, so long as they've incorporated that in the local jurisdiction. Middle income, it's not a low income project, as I said. Income cap of up to 150%. I think on Cape Cod, it's up to 200%, or no income cap. It's also a possibility. So I know that there are probably going to be a lot of questions. I can also send this deck because the next few slides just really goes into more of the weeds of how this works. And I think that it would be great for people to be able to look at that kind of on their own and come back with questions. But I'd love to hear people's questions now, if that's okay.
Well, I have a question. I'm not understanding the incentive part of it. I mean, what is that? Is that just giving money to the long-term renter, just handing them a check?
Yes.
To the property.
Property owner.
To the property owner. I
To the
mean, that's
property
what I
owner,
meant.
yes.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So it's just
Mhm.
giving them a check for doing this.
Yes, based on the number, based on the length of lease, if it's going to be a seasonal or a long-term lease, and then based on how many people, how many qualified tenants they are housing. Because the idea is that it's really to unlock units that are not otherwise being rented. And this is the incentive that kind of kicks people into the long-term rental game.
And have any of these jurisdictions had to raise property tax in order to do this?
No, not property taxes.
Okay.
Did any of your communities that you went into have a vacancy tax before?
That's a good question. I don't think so. Not no. But they have simultaneously been thinking about adding a vacancy tax.
Steve?
As far as when you pay the check, the local community to the person that's renting it, is it before the person is leasing or is it after they've leased? Is it every month? How is that incentive paid out?
That's a great question. I appreciate you asking that. Yeah, how we have suggested that it happens and this is what every market has decided to do so far, is that half of the incentive is paid at the beginning once the person has moved in, once the tenant has moved in, and then half has been paid at the end once we've done a homeowner survey with both the homeowner and the tenant, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Nobody was evicted, nobody was kicked out. There weren't like really, intense rules that were broken. Yeah. And so sometimes a tenant will say, oh no, I would like to break my lease because I just got an amazing opportunity to buy a house that's in my price range. I'm leaving 2 months early. And the homeowner and the tenant will let us know, and then we'll just prorate the second half of the incentive for that homeowner. So we've just found that it's most fair for all parties involved, tenant, homeowner, and the jurisdiction, to divide that by 2.
Aaron, you had a question?
Looks like someone has a question by phone.
Yeah, I'm trying to, am I unmuted? It's asking me all sorts of
You're
questions.
fine.
There you are.
So what is, have you seen any fair housing challenges? And if not, what advice have you gotten about general landlord-tenant fair housing rules and the Fair Housing Act?
That's a great question. That's a question that did come up a lot in the beginning, and that we were asking ourselves a lot. But after talking to attorneys at all of these jurisdictions and our own lawyers, it's been very well deemed that local employment is not a protected class, and so kind of, for lack of a better term, discriminating by only opening up this program to those who work locally is not a challenge of the Fair Housing Act.
Right. Well, the challenge would be by someone who feels that they were discriminated against because they couldn't qualify for this type of housing. I mean, the issue is, and maybe I missed it, but what's the advertising? Does it go out on Craigslist? Does it go out on, on the public marketplace, or is it just all knocking on these private doors to say, hey, will you rent the space? I mean, that's probably going to be the distinction in whether it violates the Fair Housing Act or not.
Yeah, great question. So the way that we do our marketing is through local sources, mainly we do advertisements in local channels like local media, local newspapers. But our number one way that we market to homeowners is that we send postcards to people's tax-paying addresses. So there's a way to find out what is your tax-paying address for the person who owns this property. Often in a lot of these tourist communities, it's somebody's second home. So it's not going to be the address of the actual property. So it gets people where they get their mail. And then the homeowner will call us and say, I'm really interested in this program. How do I participate? And we'll say, well, it's up to you to find the tenant. And so a lot of the times it will be in these small communities, word of mouth, or they'll say, great, I know the restaurant owner and I'm sure that they have a lot of employees who need housing. Maybe I can find somebody that way. Oh, my neighbor has been renting for a long time and the house is being sold, so they're looking for a new house. Maybe they can rent my house with this program. The other way is that we have a listing platform on our website. So homeowners can create their own listings, put them on our site, and then local employees can also go to our site and create a tenant profile and apply for the houses that way, directly to the homeowner.
Great, thanks. My concern would be even the local advertising could potentially be challenged, but it sounds like the benefits probably outweigh the risks with that. I mean, I'd be curious to see a memo or something from whichever fair housing lawyers you guys talk to solidify that. But it's America, so anyone can sue anyone for anything. We just have to weigh benefits and risks.
Yeah. And nobody's really challenged it. The only times where it's been somewhat challenged is if people work for themselves and they've, say, recently moved up from San Francisco. This happened a lot during COVID, or this was just more of a conversation during COVID, where people would move up from San Francisco, go into an Airbnb in Truckee, and then say, oh, actually, I want to stay here long term. I want to get this house because it's participating with the lease. And that house happened to be participating with the Lease to Locals program. We said, well, you're not really working locally. Like, your business is still incorporated at your old address in San Francisco. Like, you don't work for a local business. So that would be just a little bit more of a conversation.
Can I ask, is there a way that you could share a link or what would appear on your website that potential tenants could see to determine whether or not they want to answer one of the ads by one of the owners who is listed?
Yeah, I can just show you my screen if you want to see what that looks like. Where am I here? So this is what our listing site looks like. It's just right on our website, placemate.com/listings. And then you can go and select a different region. Here are all of the regions that we operate in. People just look, it just looks like a regular property management listing. It's 6-month lease, 12-month lease. This is a private room. This is a place on Cape Cod for a studio. And then it will say when you click in, this program is participating in the Lease to Locals program. Or sorry, this property is participating in the Lease to Locals program. Over here on the right, these are the following criteria, and it will come up with the program guidelines for qualified tenant specific to that area. So this will be different. This one's in North Lake Tahoe on the California side. This would be different from, say, property that you click on in Provincetown, Cape Cod. That would have their specific criteria over here. And then you can create a renter profile, and all of that information gets sent once you submit your interest to the property owner through this website.
Thank you.
You mentioned briefly the difference between converting empty homes versus converting short-term rentals. Can you kind of expand on the successes you found or what's working and what's not? I hadn't even thought about converting short-term rentals, but now I see that you're offering maybe enough incentive that the income is close enough that some people might decide to long-term rent rather than short-term rent. But can you expand on what you're talking about as far as converting empty homes versus STRs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we started the business really because we saw that there were so many empty second homes in these areas, primarily in Truckee, where we moved to at this point 8 years ago. And then when we figured out how to do this program by creating this trusted relationship between the tenant and the homeowner, then once it was suggested, oh, maybe we could put in an incentive, we thought, oh, well, that could probably then go towards opening up short-term rentals, because as you just said, that really starts to cover the delta between what people are making on short-term rentals and long-term rentals. And what we found is that a lot of people, when they first think about it, say, oh no, that would never be possible. I make way too much money on my short-term rental. There are definitely some places that were built to be built to be a vacation home. They're never going to be for locals housing. That's fine. There are definitely a lot, I would say the majority of short-term rental markets take over what was originally housing for locals, and those are now short-term rentals. And people, when they really start to think about it, will think about the headache of managing the rental, the turnover, the cleaning fees that they have to pay, the Airbnb fees that are taken out, the restrictions that are increasingly put on the short-term rental owners. And then when they take all of that out of their gross revenue that they get from these short-term rentals, they think, oh, well, actually, this incentive that's being offered is pretty close to what I am making, like what the net revenue is. So does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, but I was wondering, so you found that you're more successful in converting STRs than you are converting empty homes, or are there percentages, or what makes the difference there?
I would say that it's probably 50-50, but I could get back to you with like a handful of our markets and just send that out as a follow-up of what percentage are empty second homes and what percentage are short-term rentals. Sometimes it's kind of a mix. So like sometimes, in 1 year, people will mostly use it for their own personal use. The next year it might sit empty. The next year they might decide to do some short-term renting. It's not always so cut and dry, but I can definitely get back to you with those numbers.
And when you were showing numbers related to the number of qualified homes for the program, qualified and interested, it looked like, my very quick math, about 25% of the homes were qualified and interested. And those would include STRs, then conversions of STRs, as well as empty homes.
Yes.
And then about 20% looked like actually participated in the program. But
yes. Yeah, about 20% end up participating out of the 1,000 people who have called us so far for that one market. But yes, it's about a 20% conversion rate.
what PlaceMate does is it markets this program and it puts gets homes enrolled in the program, and then it matches up the homes with prospective tenants. And are there concerns on the part of property owners about other parts of property management that come with renting properties? I mean, what do you do when the toilets, is stuffed up, and what if there's an electrical problem? How are those concerns on the part of homeowners that are probably, 4 hours away?
Yeah, so that used to be, I think, more of a problem or just more of a concern. Like right at the beginning when we were talking to people about this before there was a lease to locals program and there was an incentive, people had that as more of a concern when they were just thinking about switching from an empty second home to a long-term rental or from a maybe not as lucrative short-term rental to a long-term rental. I think that the incentive really kind of glosses over people, helps people kind of gloss over their concerns around that. And I think that one of the things is that you just have fewer of those problems when you have a long-term rental than if you have a different person in your property every weekend. I think that a big thing that we've found is that people just treat homes a lot better when they live there long term. They treat it like their own home. And I would say that I'm a very conscientious person and a really good traveler and I also like, you don't treat an Airbnb like you treat your own home. And I've been a renter up until 3 years ago, my whole life. And I've always treated a long-term rental like my own house. And I think that that's the same for a lot of people, especially for people who are really grateful to find a really affordable rental in a place where they work. So I think that you just have a lot fewer of those problems. And then there are people who, if it's really like an investment property or just a property that you really are very hands off with and you don't really know a lot about the property, or it's always been a short-term rental, and you've used a property manager the whole time, we definitely work with property managers on behalf of owners to say, okay, let's, find a tenant for this person, and that's just the person that's kind of acts as the landlord. But the homeowner still gets the incentive.
But typically, if there's some kind of issue like that, the tenant would be calling the property owner to for repairs and plumbing and whatever it might be.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say maybe 10 to 15% of the properties that participate overall are managed by a property manager.
And is your fee based on the size of the grant program, or how is that structured?
Yeah, so depending on the size of the market, we determine how many properties we think are going to convert in a year, and that is large. That is what dictates our monthly fee. So for instance, like our bread and butter markets, let's say, 5,000 to 20,000 people are going to have about 30 properties that convert every year. And that is $7,500 a month of our administrative fee.
So I have a follow-up question from Aaron's last question is the marketing that you guys do, how do you determine which homes the postcard asking if they want to participate, or is it literally just sent to every single residential unit, the taxing address for every single residential unit in town, regardless of anything?
No, it's not sent to everybody. It's usually sent to people who own properties that are under a certain value. So like, as I said, there are certain properties that are just meant to be opulent vacation homes, and those are probably never going to be participating in these programs. We're not going to bother marketing to those people, and that's fine. And then we also take out the properties where where the property owner does not live there. And if their tax paying address does not match up with the property address, those are the people who we send the postcards to.
Okay, so what's the determination on the value? Is it the tax assessed value? Is it the real market value? How do you determine what puts it out of that category to be a rental? Because there's some houses that are fairly expensive in town that are being rented long-term currently. And then there's some that are obviously not.
Yeah, well, that's really up to the area, like property values are very different from location to location. So that's something that we would determine with the partners on the ground before we start marketing the program. And we really take their opinion into account.
Okay, because I think that might be getting at kind of towards what some of Aaron's concerns of if there's too much flexibility or too much opinion in that portion of who gets marketed to, we may end up in an issue. Aaron has his.
Aaron, you had another question?
So and maybe I missed this too, sorry, who is the landlord, or who signs the lease? Is it your company? Is it the owner of the building? Who actually is in contract with the tenant?
The homeowner is in contract with the tenant. So the homeowner will sign 2 contracts. They'll sign the lease with the tenant, which is obviously a binding contract, and then they'll sign a contract with the jurisdiction and to say, this is the program that I'm participating in. I, promise that for the length of the lease, which is this date to this date, I will be renting this property to these people. I will not be using my property for any other reason. I agree that I will be receiving this amount of money from the town or the county or whoever, at this time, and then I will be receiving the second half at this time, should I be complying by the program guidelines for that duration. And so they'll be signing both of those contracts.
And
we don't sign that contract with them. The money never flows through us. It gets very complicated for that to happen. It's much easier if the money flows just directly from the town to the homeowner.
Yeah, there's all sorts of fun legal issues here. I'm just wondering, the lease, is that some form that you've created? Do you have the homeowner, the building owner find their own lease? Obviously, and Gary, maybe I missed your question too, but when the toilet leaks, regardless of whether the tenant was using it hard or soft, if you will, at least in Oregon, and California too, but Washington, pretty much every state except a few very right-wing kind of crazy landlord friendly places. Oregon's arguably, if not the most tenant-friendly state in the country. So when something breaks, the landlord is strictly liable to fix it. So that's great that it's not in your name, but the homeowner becomes a landlord that has to deal with it directly, not in the same way that Airbnb absolves them. So again, lots of fun legal issues. I love what you're doing, and as long as the landlord understands that they're on the hook for habitability issues when they happen, again, I think this is a great program, and thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, luckily we've in over 700 properties that have been unlocked across all of the markets, we've never had an eviction. We've never had any legal disputes. Everything has been really well mediated and moderated, either with the town or through us with the homeowner and the tenant. Knock on wood, we've never had that. But yes, the homeowner does have to understand, and we talk them through a lot at the beginning when they're deciding whether or not they want to take part in the program. that they're going to be taking on that role and having that responsibility for their property when something does go wrong.
I have a question.
Lisa?
So I'm still back on the incentives because I'm curious about how that works, that the town pays. Is it a percentage? Is that how you do it? I mean, most towns, I know it's going to be different for every town and I know you can't answer for all the towns, but is it usually a percentage or how do you determine what the town is going to offer for an incentive?
Yeah, so that is also largely dictated with the partner who's with the local partner. But where we usually the starting point is usually figuring out what AMI this program is trying to serve, and then what is a fair rate for, what's a fair monthly rate per unit or just as an overall rent cap. And then figuring out for that specific area, how much are people making on short-term rentals? And then that delta is usually a good starting point for the incentives. And then we'll kind of go from there saying, no, like gut check, this is just way too high, or nobody's ever going to participate with incentives this low. And then we'll kind of figure something out from there. Obviously, of course, also looking at a budget and like what the budget can hold.
Okay.
So
And
it's not like a strict formula of this is a percentage of like the average value of the house or anything like that.
And the incentive funding falls solely on the burden of the city or jurisdiction, or is there outsourced income available?
That's up to the jurisdiction, whether or not there's going to be.
It would either be from our coffers or
Yeah, exactly.
finding a grant program.
Right.
You have.
If that.
Finding a grant
But that would be
program,
on our own to do
there's
that.
a local option tax.
And
Yeah,
manage.
as an additional, as an add-on, I can also send to Alyssa or Marcy to be sent out. I can also send the funding list that has a list of all of our markets to date and all of their funding sources, because you can see it's not all from the same place. Like some places it's general fund, some started with ARPA funding, some it's always been a local option tax. Others it's come from the housing authority. It can kind of come, people get really creative.
What does our market look like compared to some of the other ones you've worked with as far as our number of empty homes and the number of STRs?
That is a good question. I think that would depend on, I don't know. I only have just started working with Alyssa on this. And I think that it would largely depend on if this was just going to be a Cannon Beach program or if it was going to be a Clatsop County program, and taking into account the other neighboring jurisdictions.
Just so you know, Astoria and Seaside have also expressed interest in this, and we will be talking about it at the regional task force as well.
Okay.
But just to follow up on Gary's question, which is Cannon Beach by itself is a town of about 2,000 population, right? About 1,500 homes, something like that. That seems like a smaller market relative to some of the other ones you're working in, but it sounds like still the model would be feasible in a market of this size.
Yeah, definitely a market would still be feasible, even if it was just Cannon Beach. A market would still be feasible there. It would be a smaller program, which would mean just the goal for a first year would likely be around 10 properties unlocked as opposed to around 30. And then that would also mean just a generally smaller budget because our administrative fee would also be smaller.
Yeah, our STRs right now are about 200, which is probably a pretty small number compared to a lot of places. And for us, it might be more about unlocking those empty second homes that are sitting there. So if that's the case, and I don't know really if that's the situation we're in, but how does the program get modified to unlock a maximum of empty second homes?
The program works the same way, whether it's whether it's unlocking short-term rentals or empty second homes. I think that for a lot of empty second homes, people still need the monetary incentive in order to make that behavior change, or to at least even start the conversation or start thinking about, should we leave this home empty? We really only use it for a week out of the year. For that amount of money, we could just get our own Airbnb and rent this place out for a whole year. We would make monthly rent, and then we would make the incentive on top of that. But I think that marketing of an incentive program works the same for empty second homes and for short-term rentals.
So you indicated that you'd like whatever market takes on this project, to have 1 or likely 2 or 3 years worth of funding expected built up.
I think 2 years is a really good expectation. Not to say that they need to have all of that money allocated, in order to start the program, but just so that there are expectations with elected officials, with the town staff, that this program will continue past just 1 year. I think especially because, say, if you have a 1-year program and you launch on August 1st, generally by the time that things really get rolling, people are not starting to sign leases and move in for another 1 or 2 months. Even if there is marketing that starts prior to the launch of the program. And then since we do the compliance, and since all of the second checks are cut at the end of 50% of the checks are cut at the end of the lease, like all of that is going to be happening after the first year of the contract. If it's a 12.
So I was kind of asking, continuing on to the total amount that you would expect, would you do before getting more involved, would you guys do an in-depth analysis of how many vacant homes we have, how much employment is needed, and all of that, and come up with a determination of the expected number of homes that we should see buy into this program based on that, or so that we would have an idea of what sort of dollar amount we need to have prior to launching this program?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So
yes, and also just to figure out like which, if there are others, which jurisdictions are also going to be in there. Yeah, I mean, you're going to need to know like what to budget for. So we would need to know. We would need to be able to tell you what the program would cost.
And you guys do that analysis based on your successes in the past?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we know which types of housing needs assessments, housing elements, we know like which documents we need to be looking at and what data and fact finding we need to do.
We have to give them the data.
Yes.
All the data we have in giant PDFs.
Clay, you got a question?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Kai, what, I think probably easy enough for us to figure out how we would verify local employment, and this may tie somewhat into Aaron's question, what happens on renewal with verification of local employment? Do you have to go in annually and redo that, or what happens if someone becomes unemployed and they're still in this program? What are you seeing other jurisdictions do in those situations?
So it depends, because most of these programs are only a 1-year incentive program. And so if somebody changes employment, that's okay because they're only getting the incentive for the first year. And generally they say, if you're qualified for the program at the beginning of the lease, it's not like we're not going to give you the money at the second half of the lease if all of a sudden you got a raise or if all of a sudden you change jobs. But throughout that first year of the lease, there have been a couple of markets that have decided to give incentives past the first year. Say, they'll do a second year of the program and maybe they'll give the same incentives, maybe they'll give a reduced amount of the incentives. And if that is the case, then yes, we would re-qualify the tenants who are living there to make sure that they are still living locally.
Why would, it seems to me, can you still hear me okay, Kai?
Yeah.
Okay, why wouldn't we have these incentives roll into next year's? The difference between what a market rate rental unit is and what a short-term rental is, or what someone could rent, in other ways, is so dramatically different. After 1 year, it's a massive change in incentive. Why wouldn't jurisdictions roll these over? Is it just lack of funds, or is the idea that, their hope is that people will feel good about it, or what's the rationale behind that?
Okay.
Yeah, our hypothesis when we first started this program was that once people kind of dipped their toe in the long-term rental pool, they would really like it, especially if they were previously short-term renting, and that they would want to continue to long-term rent. And we found, and on that results page, I showed that we found that without a continuing incentive, 70% of homeowners will continue to rent to local employees even after there's no more incentive from the town, mostly because because jurisdictions don't want to just continue to incentivize homeowners to continue with this program. They want to incentivize them to just convert. But they don't want to continue incentivizing them on an ongoing basis, mostly from a budget standpoint. But as I said, there have been markets that have decided that they do want to continue the incentives into years 2 and 3. We have seen a couple of markets where they've taken the first year have been full incentives. The second year they've brought that down by half. And that is also an option where it's kind of weaned the homeowners off of the incentives.
It seems like one of the challenges we'll have, you said there's a lot of tools, and we'll certainly talk about a lot of the tools that we could help fund a program like this with, but one of them is this idea of a vacancy tax. It seems like if we don't have that option for homeowners to redeem or recover some of that cost, it's going to be an incredibly controversial conversation. Among other reasons people would be up in arms about that idea. So it seems to me, and maybe you have thoughts on it in the jurisdictions that used an excise or a vacancy tax, that if we didn't have this the ability to roll this over from 1 year to the next, it could put us in a really controversial spot with the electorate. Or I guess it wouldn't be electorate if they're vacant, but with homeowners.
Right. I will say that it does work well with layered restrictions on short-term rentals. So after the Lease to Locals program in Truckee, for instance, after they rolled that program out, then they started to do a moratorium on new short-term rental permits, and then a lottery system for short-term rental permits. And so once you get rid of your short-term rental permit and start renting long-term, you then don't have a huge incentive to let go of your long-term renter and go back to short-term renting, because you don't know if you're going to be able to get a short-term rental permit back. Like there are all sorts of different levers, I think, that can be pulled with like both carrots and sticks for the housing challenges. And we can definitely talk more about that.
Thank you.
Early on in your presentation, you mentioned other programs and projects, and the example was the Rooted Renters Preservation Program. I think I understand that one, but are there other things? Are these services that you've or projects that you've worked on or other ideas?
Yeah, so the Lease to Locals program has really been our bread and butter. About a year ago, we rolled out the Rooted Renters program, which we're now rolling out to subsequent markets. And then we have also started exploring taking on administration of deed restriction programs. And then we are also taking over existing rental assistance programs, which is basically like a lease to locals program that's just repackaged so that the incentive is, it's basically the money is instead going to the tenant, and although ultimately it goes to the landlord because it's to offset the cost of rent. But it's more of a dynamic incentive. So it really depends on what the tenant's income is and then what they are being charged for rent. And the difference is what is being provided to the homeowner in terms of like a rent check from the jurisdiction. And we are taking our first program that will be taking over from an existing program that was run by the housing trust, or sorry, by the housing authority, will be on Martha's Vineyard this summer.
And can you clarify what the deed restriction programs would be?
Yeah, so existing deed restriction programs or not yet existing deed restriction programs, we would be administering these to basically deal with all of the administrative paperwork that comes with deed restricting your property. In terms of the money that the homeowner gets by doing the deed restriction and the money that they're able to take out. And then doing the compliance to make sure that that house is continuing to be used with the deed restriction. So continuing to only be purchased by a local employee or a local resident for the remainder of however long the deed restriction lasts.
Gotcha, thank you.
But would the deed restriction have an incentive attached to it too? In other words, if someone deed restricted their home, they would get an incentive money from the city to do that or not?
Yeah, so usually the way that deed restrictions work is that once you deed restrict your property, you are given a certain percentage of the value of your home that you then get, with the idea that if you're deed restricting the property, you are not going to get the full market value of your home once you go to sell it.
Those often come with property tax exemptions as well.
Okay.
They can, it really depends on the area. I do have to jump. I really enjoyed this conversation and all of your questions. Alyssa and Marcy, if you can make my my email address available, I'm happy to answer many more questions from this group, and I will also send out that funding list if people want to see how this has been funded in other markets.
Okay, thank you very much. Gives us lots to think about.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good weekend. Bye.
Okay, anybody have anything for good of the order?
No, that was really interesting.
Yeah, lots to think about. Okay, meeting's adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Ideas.